All right, let's get into it. We're about to unpack one of the most complicated and, frankly, one of the most divisive conflicts of the entire 20th century, the Vietnam War. I mean, this was a war that dragged on for decades, cost millions of lives, and its aftershocks, well, they're still shaping our world today. So, how did it all begin?
You know, sometimes a single image can tell a story more powerfully than any history book ever could. This photo of a 9-year-old girl named Kim Phuc running from a napalm attack, this did exactly that. For people all over the world, this one picture brought the raw, unfiltered horror of the war right into their living rooms. And it forced them to ask one single, devastating question.
Yeah, how? How did a struggle for independence in a small Southeast Asian country spiral into a full-blown proxy war for the world's superpowers? How did it lead to this kind of devastation? Well, the answer isn't simple. To really get it, we've got to go back, way back.
The Vietnam War didn't just pop up out of nowhere. Not at all. Its seeds were actually planted almost 100 years earlier, during an age of colonialism and a burning desire for independence.
So look, the most important thing to understand here is that for nearly a century, this was a fight against foreign rule. First it was the French, then the Japanese during World War II. Ho Chi Minh and his Viet Minh, they were fighting for one thing, and one thing only: an independent, unified Vietnam. And when they finally defeated the French in 1954, you'd think, okay, story's over, they won. But it was far from over.
In fact, the end of that war just set the stage for the next one. As soon as France was out, two new, much bigger players stepped onto the field, the United States and the Soviet Union. Suddenly, Vietnam wasn't just Vietnam anymore. It was a new front in the global Cold War.
The major powers came up with a plan called the Geneva Accords. They basically drew a line on the map, splitting the country in two. But here's the key. It was supposed to be temporary. The whole idea was to hold an election in a couple of years to let the Vietnamese people decide their own future. But in the tense atmosphere of the Cold War, that election never happened.
And that created this stark new reality. In the north, you had the communist revolutionary leader Ho Chi Minh, backed by the Soviet Union and China. And in the south, you had an anti-communist government heavily supported by the United States. The battle lines were no longer just local, they were global.
So this brings us to the big question, right? Why did the United States feel it had to get so deeply involved in a conflict literally halfway around the world?
Well, for the US, this was never just about Vietnam. It was about containing communism. There was this idea called the domino theory, a genuine fear that if South Vietnam fell, it would set off a chain reaction. Laos would fall, then Cambodia, then Thailand, one by one, just like dominoes. And that theory became the justification for everything that came next.
At first, American involvement was pretty cautious. Under President Kennedy, the U.S. sent military advisors, that's the word they used, to train the South Vietnamese army. But the anti-communist government was weak, and it was clear they were losing ground, fast.
And then, the flashpoint, an event called the Gulf of Tonkin Incident. There was a report, and it's still debated today, that a U.S. warship was attacked. Well, that was all President Lyndon B. Johnson needed. Congress gave him the authority to wage a full-scale war without ever officially declaring one.
The result was just a massive, massive escalation. Just look at that jump. In only 2 years, the U.S. presence went from 16,000 advisors to more than 184,000 combat troops. There was no turning back. America was at war.
What followed was just years of brutal, grinding warfare. The United States hoped its overwhelming firepower could just wear the enemy down. But the North Vietnamese and their allies in the South, the Viet Cong, they proved to be an incredibly resilient and determined force.
In 1968, the war hit its psychological turning point. It was called the Tet Offensive. Now, militarily, it was a disaster for the North Vietnamese. They lost a huge number of fighters. But politically, it was a catastrophe for the United States. It completely shattered the narrative back home that the war was almost won. Public support for the war just collapsed.
So, with anti-war protests growing, President Richard Nixon came in with a new strategy called Vietnamization. The plan was to gradually pull American troops out while building up the South Vietnamese army so they could fight the war themselves. It was basically a search for an honorable way out.
And in 1973, they finally signed a peace treaty. The American troops went home, the POWs were released. But everyone knew this peace was incredibly fragile. Without American firepower to back them up, the question wasn't if the South would fall, but when. 2 years later, they got their answer. North Vietnamese tanks rolled right into Saigon. The long, bloody conflict was finally over. After decades of fighting, Vietnam was one country again, reunited under a communist government.
But just because the fighting stopped, that doesn't mean the suffering did. The end of the war was really just the beginning of trying to reckon with its devastating legacy. A legacy measured in lost lives, broken families, and a literally poisoned landscape.
The human cost is just staggering. It's estimated that around 3 million Vietnamese people, soldiers and civilians, were killed during this conflict. An entire generation was just decimated.
And for the United States, the war left a deep, painful wound. More than 58,000 Americans lost their lives. And the conflict created these deep divisions in society that you could argue have taken decades to even begin to heal.
And the scars weren't just human. To destroy the jungle cover the Viet Cong used, the U.S. military sprayed millions of gallons of toxic chemicals, most famously Agent Orange. It didn't just kill the forests. It caused catastrophic health problems, like cancers and severe birth defects, that are still afflicting people in Vietnam to this day.
So in the end, what do we take away from all of this? The Vietnam War started as a fight for a nation's identity, and it got twisted by Cold War politics into this global tragedy. It's a stark and pretty timeless reminder that the path of war, which is so often paved with promises of peace, really only leads to devastation for generations.